Oh, my friends, there is no friend. In addressing you in this way, perhaps I have not yet said anything. Perhaps I have not even addressed myself to you. Not only because the two parts of this sentence, oh, my friends, there is no friend, on the one side and on the other side of a comma or a pause, oh, my friends, there is no friend, seem incompatible with each other, destined to annihilate themselves in their contradiction. But firstly, because I have not yet said anything in my own name, I have contented myself with quoting. Spokesman for another, I have reported his words, which belong to a foreign or perhaps somewhat archaic language. I have then signed nothing, booked nothing to my own account. Oh, my friends, there is no friend. This is not merely a citation which I'm reading at present. It was already the quotation by another reader of the country I come from, Montaigne. Il faut employer le mot qu'Aristote avait très familier. Ô mes amis, il n'y a nul ami. It is a saying which, he says, Aristotle was used to repeating. In other words, I have quoted the quotation of a saying already attributed to Aristotle, a saying whose origin seems to lose itself in the anonymity of time immemorial. Nonetheless, it is not one of those proverbs without an assignable origin, and whose aphoristic mode rarely takes the form of an apostrophe. I would like, within the very space of this meditation on friendship, to engage a study of quotation and of the quotation of an apostrophe. What happens when one quotes an apostrophe? Later on, we will connect these themes up to those of the friend's name and death, of memoirs and of testaments. In the Eudemian ethics, Aristotle inscribed friendship, knowledge, and death within the same configuration, in a constellation whose necessity gives much pause for thought. He begins by remarking that it is more appropriate in friendship to love than to be loved, which somewhat complicates the mutualist and, if I may say so, the reciprocalist schema which he seems to privilege elsewhere. He goes on to give a proof of this. If a friend had to choose between knowing and being known, he would choose knowing rather than being known. To make this point clear, Aristotle gives the example of what women do in Typhon's Andromache. They put their children in the care of a nurse and love them without seeking to be loved in return. They know themselves to be loving. They know that they love and whom they love, while accepting that they are neither known nor loved in return. To want to be known and loved, Aristotle then says, is an egoistic feeling, and he concludes, I quote, "It is for this reason that we praise those who continue to love their dead ones, for they know but are not known." Unquote. Friendship for one who is dead thus carries this philia to the limit of its possibility. Is this asymmetry consistent with the law of symmetry and with other Aristotelian axioms, such as, for example, the one according to which the friend is another ourself, who must have the feeling of his own existence, or the one according to which friendship proceeds from self-love. This is a question I will leave aside for the moment. On the subject of the death of friends, of memory and of testaments, I will simply begin by pointing out that the chain of this quotation of a quotation, "Oh, my friend, there is no friend," stretches back through the philosophical literature of the West like an immense murmur, from Aristotle to Kant, from Montaigne to Nietzsche, who turns it around in the following way, in a passage from Human All Too Human, von den Freuden, to which I will return. I quote Nietzsche. "Perhaps the hour of joy, die freudigere Stunde, will also come on a day when everyone will say, wo sagt, Freunde, es gibt keine Freunde, so rief der sterbende Weise, Feinde, es gibt keinen Feind, ruf ich, der lebende Tor. Friends, there are no friends, cried the dying wise man. Enemies, there are no enemies, cry I, the living madman, or the living fool." Unquote. A number of paths are opened up by a reading of this reversing apostrophe, which converts the friend into an enemy, and which, in short, complains of the enemy's disappearance. In any case, fears it, recalls it, announces or denounces it as a catastrophe. Later on, we will situate one of these paths, the one we could more or less strictly call political. It would lead back to a tradition that, in a naturally differentiated and complicated manner, goes back at least to Hegel, and that will take a systematic form in Carl Schmitt. In truth, it is the political as such, nothing more nor less, the political as such, that would no longer exist without the figure and without the determined possibility of the enemy, according to Schmitt. Without the determined possibility of the enemy, that is, of an actual war. In losing the enemy, one would simply lose the political itself. And this would be, according to Schmitt, the horizon of the post-world wars. In Der Begriff des Politischen, the concept of the political, 1932, Schmitt, whose relationships to Nazism on the one hand and to Heidegger on the other are of the greatest complexity, and one would also have to mention Leo Strauss at this point. Schmitt writes, for example, I quote, "The specific political distinction, die spezifische politische Unterscheidung, to which political actions and motives can be reduced, is that between friend and enemy, die Unterscheidung von Freund und Feind." Unquote. The distinction or the differential mark of the political amounts to a discrimination, Unterscheidung, between friend and enemy, and this Unterscheidung is not merely a difference. It is a determined opposition, the opposition itself. Should this opposition be effaced and war with it, the region named the political would lose its boundaries or its specificity. Schmitt draws a great many consequences from this axiom and from these definitions, notably as concerned a certain depoliticization as the essential risk of modern humanity, and even of humanity, period, which as such, according to Schmitt, as such, the humanity knows nothing of the figure of the enemy. We will come back, of course, to these consequences. Schmitt claims he is reviving a tradition which was beginning to die out. Whether one accredits them or not, certain of his remarks ought to interest us here. I will underline two of them at least. First, without proposing any equivalence or symmetry for the friend, that is the opposing term of the distinction, of the Unterscheidung, Schmitt considers that the enemy has always been taken to be public. The concept of a private enemy would have no meaning. One feels that the very sphere of the public emerges with the figure of the enemy. I quote Schmitt in the concept of the political. One may or may not share these hopes and pedagogical ideals, but rationally speaking, it cannot be denied that nations continue to group themselves according to the friend and enemy antithesis, that the distinction still remains actual today, and that it is an ever-present possibility for every people existing in the political sphere. The enemy is not merely any competitor or just any partner of a conflict in general. He is also not the private adversary whom one hates. An enemy exists only when, at least potentially, one fighting collectivity of people confronts a similar collectivity. The enemy is solely the public enemy because everything that has a relationship to such a collectivity of men, particularly to a whole nation, becomes public by virtue of such a relationship. The enemy is hostis, not inimicus, and this distinction is absolutely fundamental for Schmitt. The enemy is hostis, not inimicus, that is foe, you will say, and not enemy. Hostis, not inimicus in the broader sense. Polemios, not extros. And he has here a footnote saying, referring to Plato, in his Republic, Plato strongly emphasizes the contrast between the public enemy, polemios, and the private one, ektros. But in connection with the other antithesis of war, polemos, and insurrection, upheaval, rebellion, civil war, stasis. Real war for Plato is a war between Greeks, Hellenes, and barbarians only, etc. And he goes on, as German and other languages do not distinguish between the private and political enemy, many misconceptions and falsifications are possible. The often quoted love your enemies, Gospel according to Matthew and Luke, reads diligite inimicos vestros, agapate tous ectrus humon, that is the private enemies, and not diligite hostes vestros, the public enemy. No mention is made of the political enemy in the Gospel, in this passage from the Gospel. Never in the 1,000-year struggle between Christians and Muslims did it occur to a Christian to surrender rather than defend Europe out of love toward the Saracens or Turks. The enemy in the political sense need not be hated personally, and in the private sphere only does it make sense to love one's enemy, i.e. one's adversary. Second point, the modern definition of the enemy goes back to Hegel, according to Schmitt. But modern philosophers already have a tendency to avoid it, just like they do avoid the political. In fact, insofar as it is linked to a certain concept and to a certain practice of war. I quote again Schmitt, in the concept of the political, Hegel also offers the first polemically political definition of the bourgeois. The bourgeois is an individual who does not want to leave the apolitical, riskless private sphere. He rests in the possession of his private property and under the justification of his possessive individualism, he acts as an individual against the totality. He is a man who finds his compensation for his political nullity in the fruits of freedom and enrichment, and above all in the total security of its use. Consequently, he wants to be spared bravery and exempted from the danger of a violent death. Hegel has also advanced a definition of the enemy which in general has been evaded by modern philosophers. The enemy is a negated otherness, but this negation is mutual, and this mutuality of negations has its own concrete existence as a relation between enemies. This relation of two nothingnesses on both sides bears the danger of war. Quote Hegel by Schmidt. This war is not a war of families against families, but between peoples, and hatred becomes thereby undifferentiated and freed from all particular personality. Unquote. And Schmidt goes on. The question is how long the spirit of Hegel has actually resided in Berlin. In any event, the new political tendency which dominated Prussia after 1840 preferred to avail itself of a conservative philosophy, whereas, especially one furnished by Friedrich Julius Stahl, whereas Hegel wandered to Moscow via Karl Marx and Lenin. His dialectical method became established there and found its concrete expression in a new concrete enemy concept, namely that of the international class enemy, and transformed itself, the dialectical method, as well as everything else, legality and illegality, the state, even the compromise with the enemy, into a weapon of this battle. The actuality of Hegel is very much alive in Georg Lukács. That was in 1932. In the discussion probably Wednesday, I would quote a letter by Heidegger to Schmidt in 1933, which could shed more light on this configuration. Again, forgive me for those long quotations. Another long quotation, and then I will leave Schmidt for a moment. There always are concrete human groupings which fight other concrete human groupings in the name of justice, humanity, order, or peace. When being reproached for immorality and cynism, the spectator of political phenomena can always recognize in such reproaches a political weapon used in actual combat. Political thought and political instinct prove themselves theoretically and practically in the ability to distinguish friend and enemy. The high points of politics are simultaneously the moments in which the enemy is, in concrete clarity, recognized as the enemy. And a note about nationalism in English language. With regard to modern times, there are many powerful outbreaks of such enmity. There is the by no means harmless écraser l'infâme of the 18th century, the fanatical hatred of Napoleon felt by the German barons Stein and Kleist. Exterminate them, the French. The Last Judgment will not ask you for your reasons. Lenin's annihilating sentences against bourgeois and Western capitalism. All these are surpassed by Cromwell's enmity towards Papist Spain. He says in his speech of September 1956, the first thing, therefore, that I shall speak to is that is the first lesson of nature, being and preservation. The conservation of that, namely of our national being, is first to be viewed with respect to those who seek to undo it, and so make it not to be. Let us consider our enemies, the enemies to the very being of these nations, and he, says Schmidt, he, that is Cromwell, always repeats this very being or national being and then proceeds, that is Cromwell. Why, truly, our great enemy is the Spaniard. He is a natural enemy. He is naturally so. He is naturally so throughout by reason of that enmity that is in him against whatsoever is of God. Whatsoever is of God which is in you, or which may be in you. Then he repeats, the Spaniard is your enemy. His enmity is put into him by God. He is the natural enemy, the providential enemy. And he who considers him to be an accidental enemy is not well acquainted with Scripture and the things of God, who says, I will put enmity between your seed and her seed. With friends, Cromwell again, with friends one can make peace, not with Spain, because it is a papist state, and the Pope maintains peace only as long as he wishes. Now, when Nietzsche writes, enemies, there are no enemies, cry I, the living fool or madman, this reversing apostrophe, this, I would say, catapostrophe, thus defines the modern and anti-modern landscape contained between Hegel and Schmitt, understood and determined as such by Hegel and Schmitt. Nietzsche, or the living fool, could mean, among many other equally enigmatic things, that there is no more politics, no more great politics, as he was used to say, in order to complain of it rather than rejoice in it. But I have said that I will not for the moment enter this path. We will encounter Schmitt again a little later in the vicinity of Heidegger, in fact, Wednesday. The vicinity that is both the proximity and the distance, the difference and the affinity. Let us for the moment turn rather to the friend. Schmitt has indeed been reproached for having made the enemy and not the friend the properly positival conceptual criterion, das eigentliche positive Begriffsmerkmal, in defining the political. In his preface to the 1963 re-edition of the concept of the political, Schmitt replies by invoking the privilege that negation must maintain in a dialectical determination of what he calls the life of justice and the theory of justice. So I will leave Schmitt at the side of the road for the time being, and will return to Nietzsche catapostrophe from another point of view. If something is converted or inverted in these two apostrophes, it is perhaps not in the content of the utterances, that is, the transformation of friendship into enmity, which perhaps leaves things intact, but rather in the modalities of the utterances, of the utterance. In place of the quotation in the past, so rief, I cried, of an exclamation attributed to a dying wise man, der sterbende Weise, is the quotation, or rather the performative utterance, of a present exclamation, ruf ich, cry I, for which a first person answers, introducing himself precisely as a living fool. Ruf ich der lebende Tor. In what way does Nietzsche here overturn a Greek tradition of philia? In what way, we will ask later on, will he rather denounce, in a context which will rather be that of Zarathustra, the Christian transformation which prefers the neighbor to the Greek friend? Let us note for the moment that the citational murmur appears not to have begun but to have found the simulacrum of its inauguration, but which may be the origin of a murmur, with Diogenes Laertius, who, while not directly quoting Aristotle, quotes the memoirs of Favorinos on Aristotle. It is in the chapter of Diogène Laërce's Lives, Doctrines, and Sayings of Famous Philosophers that he devotes to Aristotle. After having described the tenor of Aristotle's testament, Diogenes Laertius tells of the fine sayings of the philosopher. One of them answers the question, what is a friend? And it answers this question, what is a friend, with this, quote, a single soul and two bodies. Further on, instead of directly quoting the sentence written by Aristotle, Diogenes Laertius prefers to quote Favorinos's memoirs, which themselves quote Aristotle's words. In spite of their surface discontinuity, certain series of sayings resemble chains of aphorism drawn together by a secret logic. And ethico-political thematics, for example, associates a certain egalitarianism, the idea of distributive or proportional justice, and a certain concept of the rights of man or of the human person, with this ambiguous complaint, oh my friend, there is no true friend. For example, quote, people reproached him, Aristotle, for having given alms to a scoundrel. He answered, for the fact is also reported in this way, he answered, I did not give to the individual, but to the man. This saying can be juxtaposed with the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle recalls the friendship due to the slave as a man and not as a slave. The Eudemian Ethics indeed reserves the first and highest friendship for man as opposed to animals. The friendship, from the first and highest friendship, from which all others, in a sense, derive their name, even if they are not simply homonyms of it, even if they are not types of friendships, and are not related to this first meaning in a quite equivocal manner. This first meaning of friendship, which is also the highest, if not the universal meaning, is that of friendship founded upon virtue, upon excellence. Jonathan referred to this a moment ago. Upon virtue. That's the first and highest sense of friendship. It is reserved for man because it implies that this faculty of deliberation, boulesis, which belongs neither to animals nor to God. There is no friendship, at least in this first sense, there is no friendship with or between animals, with or between gods. But one is not allowed to talk only of friendship in the first sense of the word without being caught within several paradoxes. For there is also friendship founded on usefulness, and this is the case precisely for concord as political friendship. So the political friendship is not the friendship par excellence. It's a kind of friendship founded on utility, usefulness, in Eudemus. Or there is a third kind of friendship founded on pleasure, an unstable friendship found particularly among young people. These three friendships, founded on virtue first and highest, on usefulness and on pleasure. These three friendships imply equality, but Aristotle also evokes a friendship which implies superiority. The friendship of a divine being for a man. That is not a friendship which is shared, but a asymmetrical friendship. The friendship of a divine being for a man, of a governor for the governed, of a father for his son, of a husband for his wife, is another kind of friendship. And they also differ among each other, implying no absolute reciprocity. And it is during the development devoted to this inequality that Aristotle evokes friendship for the dead. The friendship, you remember, the friendship that knows without being known. I will now come back to the series of Aristotelian sayings reported by Diogenes Laertius. I quote, people reproached him for having given alms to a scoundrel. He answered, I didn't give to the individual but to the man. People asked him now how one ought to conduct oneself with one's friends. Answer, as we would like to see them conduct themselves towards us. He defined justice as a virtue of the soul which has people give to each according to his own merit. He affirmed that study is the greatest asset in reaching old age. Favorinus says finally, in his memoirs, book 2, that he loved to exclaim, "Oh, my friends, there is no true friend," unquote. And one can, in fact, find this sentence in the seventh book of the Ethics. The little word true, that's what Diogenes says, of course. The little word true, there is no true friendship, obviously carries within it the whole enigma. To begin in a very schematic way, and even before beginning, I would say that the interpretation of this apostrophe can appeal to two great logics. The first can make true friendship, the first friendship, protephilia, in the Eudemian ethics, perfect or complete friendship, teleia philia, in the Nicomachean ethics. So the first interpretation can make true friendship an arche or a telos towards which one must strive, even if one never reaches it. The inaccessibility in this case is merely a distancing within the immensity of a homogeneous space and of a road along which to go. But one could interpret the inaccessibility in another way. In another way, that is, in terms of a thinking of the alterity, which makes true or perfect friendship not only inaccessible as a conceivable telos, but inaccessible because it is inconceivable in its very essence. From the point of view of this second interpretation, the inaccessibility would take on then a quite different meaning, that of a prohibitive bar within the very concept of friendship. As Pierre Aubin, a French philosopher expert in Aristotle, as Pierre Aubin says, I quote him, perfect friendship destroys itself. It would be contradictory in its very essence. On the one hand, one must want the greatest good for one's friend, and thus that he become a god. But one cannot want this, and I would say there are at least three reasons for that, for why one cannot want this. One is that there is no longer any possibility of friendship with God by virtue of his distance or his separation. See Nicomachus. But also because of the absence of a common measure of proportional equality between God and myself. So one cannot want God for a friend. The second reason is that friendship commands me to love the other the way he is. I always say he and not she, or she, as you usually do, for a reason which will become clear Wednesday. The friendship commands me to love the other the way he is by wishing him to remain as he is, and to do so according to his nature as man. That's a quote. Friendship is, again, in its origin and in its end, in its first sense and in its full realization, the essence of man. Friendship is the essence of man. So one cannot want to deify a friend. And yet, and this is the third and doubtless most radical reason, the man of friendship, as a man of virtue, ought to resemble God. Now, God has no need of friends. He thinks himself and not anything else. The noesis noeseos, the thought of thought, thinking of thinking, which characterizes the prime mover, as well as, in the same tradition, absolute knowledge in Hegel's sense of the term. The noesis noeseos, or the absolute knowledge, has nothing to do with friendship, because it has nothing to do with the other. Perfect or true friendship, that of the just and virtuous man who wishes to be like God, thus tends towards this divine autarkeia, autarky, autonomy, which can easily do without the other, and which thus has no relationship to friendship any more than it does to the other's death. It is precisely in a development devoted to this autarky that Aristotle underlines this sort of aporia. I quote, "Because God is such that he has no need of friends, we conclude that it is the same for the man who resembles God. But then, if one follows this reasoning, we will also have to say that the valorous or virtuous, spudaios, the virtuous man, does not even think. For God's perfection does not reside in thought. God is superior to any thought which would be a thought of something else or of the other, unless he thinks himself. The reason for this, in our opinion, is that the good implies a relationship to the other, whereas God is for himself his own good. The good implies a relationship to the other, whereas God is for himself his own good. Aition de oti emin men to e kat eteron, ekei no de otos otu to e estin. That's in the Adamian Ethics. This passage clearly shows that true friendship can only be human, but most of all, and at the same time, that for man there is no thought unless it is a thought of the other, and a thought of the other as a thought of the mortal other, of the mortality of the other. Within the same logic, there is no thought, there is no thinking being, at least if thought has to be thought of the other, except in friendship. There is no thinking except in friendship. Thought, insofar as it has to be thought of the other, and this is, what it must be for man, does not exist without philia. We will come across this affinity of philein with thought and with mortality, again, later on, in following through another train of thought. By beginning in this way, that is, quoting the quotation of a quotation, as I just said, I have perhaps not assumed the responsibility in my own name for any utterance. When I said, "Oh, my friends, there is no friend." Perhaps I have not even yet addressed myself to you, really to you. But are things that simple? Am I completely irresponsible for what I have said when I am not responsible for what I have said? Am I not responsible for the fact that I have said, for the fact of having spoken, when I do not hold myself responsible for what I have said, for the content of what I have said, and which I, in fact, have contented myself with reporting? Defined by what are commonly called conventions, a certain number of artificial signs attest to the following. Even if I have not yet said anything determinate in my name, when I uttered, in order to begin, without any further introduction, "Oh, my friends, there is no friend," one has the right. One has the right. But what is this right? One has the right to suppose that I am nonetheless speaking in my name. And I would also like here to approach obliquely, and for example, for the fact of quoting Montaigne in order to begin, in place of and before saying anything else. And by holding me personally responsible, you are, in a rigorous sense, implying some knowledge of what person and responsibility mean. What is happening at this very moment? This could give rise to a description of a pragmatic type. Such a description would confirm that, having been invited, but how and exactly by whom finally, having been invited by people, by an institution and so on, but this is very indeterminate, having been invited to speak to you when you are assembled to listen to me, then to discuss with me, in short, to respond to me, I have already responded to an invitation, and consequently I am in the process of addressing myself to you who are beginning to respond to me. You are doing so in a way which is still virtual with respect to the content of the response, but you are already doing so actually with respect to that first response constituted by the attention given, or at least promised, to a discourse. You should note in passing that with this distinction between virtuality, potentiality, and actuality, with this distinction, I am already virtually installed in the dominant code, in the very constitution of one of the great canonical discourses of philosophy and friendship. And my topic here, and this will, I hope, become more clearer and clearer as I advance, as I go on. The question is, what is a canonical discourse? And on the example of a canonical philosophical discourse on friendship. I am so virtually installed with this distinction between potentiality and act in the dominant code of one of the great canonical discourses of philosophy on friendship, the very one which Montaigne was quoting Aristotle's. The distinction between dynamis and energeia, that is potentiality and act. This distinction is never far away in the Nicomachean ethics, when the issue is the distinction between, I quote, the good men who are friends in the rigorous sense of the term, and the others who are so only accidentally and by analogy with the first. Or between, on the one hand, the protephilia, the first friendship of the Eudemian ethics, or the teleiaphilia, the perfect achieved friendship of the Nicomachean ethics. And on the other hand, the other friendships founded on usefulness, the political friendship, or pleasure for the young people. Or again, after having defined the three forms of government, Aristotle declares that, I quote, friendship appears there in the same proportion as justice. Or, if man is a political being, as he says, political friendship is only a kind of friendship, that which he calls concord, homonomia. We should reconstitute these sequences. So you are already holding me responsible for what I say, for the simple fact that I am speaking, even if I am not yet assuming the responsibility of the sentence I am citing and even analyzing. Let us suppose, just an hypothesis, concesso non dato. Let us suppose that one can translate these Greek words, philia, homonomia, today by friendship, Freundschaft, amitié. And everything, I think this will become clear, everything will here depend upon thinking the possibility of this translation and thinking thought as thought of the same or as thought of the other in terms of the possibility of this transfer or this train or this streetcar named philia, Freundschaft, amitié, friendship. A translation which is already problematic in the Greek language itself. Within the Greek language, the translation is a problem, and Aristotle knew it better than anyone. The Greek language had to, in fact, have recourse to the same word, philia, for different and derived meanings, which were inadequate for philia prote and teleiaphilia. For instance, the friendship founded on usefulness or pleasure are friendships, so he uses the same word, but the same word doesn't refer to the same concept. But it's not simply, the choice of the word is not simply arbitrary. So Aristotle's discourse is a very complex reflection on the translation within the same word of different concepts. So Aristotle's whole discourse on philia is a discourse on language, on the word philia, its uses, its contexts, its regulated equivocality, its legitimate or its abusive translations. Even supposing one could translate these words without anything being left over in our languages, I still do not know if what exists between us here is philia or homonomia, nor how one should distinguish here among us, among each one of us, who together would compose this as yet quite indeterminate us. But perhaps you will concede the following, which is something like the first result of a practical demonstration, the one that has just taken place. Before even having taken responsibility in our name or in each of our names for any given affirmation, we are already caught up in a kind of asymmetrical and heteronomical curvature of the social space. More precisely, in their relation to the other prior to any organized sociality, to any determined government, to any law. Please note, prior to any determined law, as either natural law or positive law, but not prior to any law in general. This heteronomical and asymmetrical curvature of a sort of originary sociality is a law and perhaps the very essence of the law. What is taking place at this moment, the disquieting experience we're having, is perhaps just the silent unfolding of that strange violence which has since forever insinuated itself into the origin of the most innocent experience of friendship or justice. We have begun to respond. We are already caught or surprised, I would say in French, pris, surpris, in a certain responsibility, and the most ineluctable of responsibilities, as if it were possible. That's my problem. That's our problem here. As if it were possible to conceive a responsibility without freedom, which for a classical philosopher is simply stupidity. As if it were possible to conceive a responsibility without freedom. We are invested with an undeniable responsibility at the moment we begin to signify something. But where does that begin? This responsibility assigns us our freedom without leaving it with us, if one could put it that way. It assigns us our freedom without leaving it with us. And we see it coming from the other. It is assigned to us by the other, from the other, before any hope of reappropriation permits us to assume this responsibility in the space of what could be called autonomy. This experience is even the one in which the other appears as such, that is, appears without appearing. I insisted on this strange structure in the text on Levinas and violence and metaphysics. The fact that the other appears as such, that the other cannot appear as such. That is, he or she appears as such in not appearing. There is no as such structure for the other, which means that there is no pure phenomenology of the other. And that's why Husserl met so many difficulties in dealing with the other. So that which comes before autonomy must then also exceed it, exceed the autonomy, that is, succeed it and survive it, and indefinitely surpass it. In general, when dealing with the law, with the nomos, one believes one can simply oppose autonomy and heteronomy. Perhaps one would have to deform this oppositional logic and prepare from very far away its political translation. To sum it up in one word, and because it's good for reasons of clarity during the lecture to anticipate in a number of ways and to announce a focal point, it is a question of a political translation whose risks and difficulties, whose aporias even, one could hardly exaggerate. After having foregrounded a scansion in a kind of history of friendship, a scansion which would have introduced asymmetry, separation, and infinite distance into a Greek philia, which did not tolerate them, I would like to suggest that a democracy still to come, and not yet given, not yet thought, even one still suppressed or repressed, such a democracy to come, still to come, such a democracy not only would not contradict this asymmetrical curve and this infinite heterogeneity, but in truth would be called forth by them. This asymmetry and infinite alterity would not only not bear any relationship to what Aristotle would have called inequality or superiority, but they would be incompatible. This asymmetry and this infinite alterity. Not only they would not bear any relationship to Aristotle's inequality or superiority, but they would be incompatible with any socio-political hierarchy as such. And later on it will appear that beyond a certain determination of justice and calculation of measure and metrics, but not of justice in general, this democracy to come, still to come, would free a certain interpretation of equality from what I will define as, on Wednesday, the phallogocentric schema of fraternity, which I will attempt to show has been determining and dominant in our traditional concept of friendship. Brotherhood, fraternity. A democracy which wouldn't be grounded on the scheme of the brother. In what sense could one still talk of equality, even of symmetry, within the asymmetry and measurelessness of infinite alterity? What right would we have to still talk of politics, of right and of democracy? Do these words have to totally change their meaning, allow themselves to be translated? And what then will be the rule governing this translation? I was talking just now of an excessive assignation of responsibility. What can this excessive assignation of responsibility have to do with that which is called friendship? And I say advisedly, that which is called friendship, and I underscore this precaution, and it resembles, once again, a quotation, as if I were forcing myself to remember unceasingly that before knowing what friendship is and what we mean to say here and now with this word, we should first deal with a certain use of the word friendship. We should mention these uses as well as the interpretations and experiences, for experiences are also interpretations, the interpretations and experiences which friendship has occasioned. For we should not forget that we are speaking first of all from within the tradition of a certain concept of friendship, within a given culture, let us say ours, in any case the one on the basis of which a certain we, us, here tries its luck. Now, neither this tradition nor the concept of friendship within it is homogeneous. Our principal concern will even be to recognize the major marks of a tension within it, perhaps even ruptures, and in any case, scansions. Let us listen once again to Montaigne, listening to Diogenes, listening to Aristotle, etc. But let us translate and interpret him as well. Oh, my friend, there is no friend. The painful and plaintive irony of the address also states the certitude of a strange affirmation. The phrase springs forth like a sort of apostrophe. In effect, someone, that's the apostrophe structure, In effect, someone is turning towards his friends, "Oh, my friends," but the apostrophe carries within it a predicative proposition. It envelopes an indicative declaration. Ascertaining a fact, it also utters a general truth. There is no friend. The general truth of the fact would seem to contradict by an act the very possibility of the apostrophe. The possibility for it to be serious. If there are no friends, how could I call you my friends? And if I call you my friends, can I say there are no friends, etc.? There must indeed be friends in order for me to address myself to them in this way, if only so as to say to them, there is no friend. So the performative contradiction would be as vivid and present as a simple logical absurdity. In the best of cases, it would be the playful exercise of a paradox. If the structures of the two utterances, "Oh, my friend, there is no friend," if the structures of the two utterances were symmetrical, and if they belonged to a presently homogeneous ensemble. This is not necessarily the case. The apostrophe, whose form surpasses and comprises in itself the alleged determination of fact, resembles at once and the same time an act of recalling and an appeal, un rappel, I would say in French, et un appel. It resembles an appeal because it makes a sign toward the future. Be my friends, for I love you or will love you. And friendship consists rather in loving than in being loved, a proposition which we have not yet finished meditating. So listen to me, be sensitive to my cry, understand and be compassionate. I'm asking for sympathy and consensus. Become the friends to whom I aspire. Accede to what is at the same time a desire, a request, and a promise. And what could also add a prayer. A prayer. And let us not forget what Aristotle said about prayer, euche. Euche, prayer, he says, is a discourse, logos. But it is a discourse that, somewhat in the manner of a performative, is neither true nor false. Al ute aletes ute pseudes. So, there are no friends that we know, but I beg you, make it so that there will be friends from now on. What is more, how could I be your friend and declare my friendship for you, and the latter consists more in loving than in being loved, if friendship did not remain something yet to happen, to be desired, to be promised? How could I give you my friendship where friendship would not be lacking, promised then lacking? That is, if it already existed. More precisely, if the friend were not lacking. For the apostrophe does not say there is no friendship, but rather there is no friend. And perhaps this is because we have an idea of friendship and what it should be, in the ideality of its essence or telos, teleia philia, and thus, in the name of friendship, we must conclude, alas, that if there is friendship, there is no friend. And this is just what Montaigne means to say in the context determined by the most thematic of his intentions, which dominate the passage up to a certain point. It is while thinking about what he calls common friendships, or ordinary and customary ones, that we are obliged to sigh with regret. There is no excellent friendship. These common friendships, he says, are not the most perfect of their kind. That's why there is no friend. But if there is no friend at present, then precisely let us make it so that there will be friendships from now on, friendships that are the most perfect of their kind. Here is what I'm calling you to experience, to answer me. It is our responsibility. Friendship is never a given in the present. It's not a present in the sense of being given. It belongs to the experience of waiting, of promise, or of commitment. Its discourse is that of responsibility or prayer. And at issue, there is that which responsibility opens to the future. But the apostrophe, "Oh, my friends," turns also toward the past. It recalls, it makes a sign toward that which must be supposed so as to let oneself be understood, if only in the non-apophantic form of a prayer. You have, I'm just paraphrasing here, you have already, paraphrasing no, but just describing the implications. You have already shown me this minimal friendship, this preliminary consent without which you would not understand me. You would not listen to my appeal or be sensitive to what is hopeful in my cry. Without this absolute past, I could not, for my part, have addressed myself to you in this way. We would not be together in a sort of minimal community, but one which is also incommensurable with any other. The minimal community speaking the same language or praying for translation within the horizon of the same language, even were it so as to manifest a disagreement. If a sort of friendship had not already been sealed before any other contract, a friendship prior to friendships, an ineffaceable, fundamental, and bottomless friendship, the one which draws its breath in the sharing of a language, past or to come, never present, and in the being together which any allocution supposes, including a declaration of war. Will one say, in a rather Aristotelian move, that this friendship, the one I'm alluding to now, has merely an accidental and analogical relation or potential relation with friendship in the strict or proper sense, or with the friendship which is, I quote Montaigne, perfect of its kind? The question thus becomes, what is friendship in the proper sense? Is it ever present? What is presence for this philia prote, or for this teleia philia, whose aporia we looked at briefly just now? Or what is the essence of friendship? I will conclude with this question. If we are not close to answering this question, it is not only because of the very great number of philosophical difficulties still in front of us, and which we are going to try to approach in a preliminary and principial manner, at the same time simple and abyssal. If we are not close to answering this question, it is because the question, what is, τι εστιν, that is the question of essence or truth, has unfolded itself as the question of philosophy on the basis of a certain experience of philia and philein. The question τι εστί, what is the essence, what is the presence, what is the existence, what is the presence of the present, cannot be simply applied to friendship as to an example of it, because, that will be my first point on Wednesday, because this question TST has unfolded itself on the basis of a certain experience of philein and philia. The question, what is, presupposes friendship. Thank you.